we're looking at a video from History Matters called How Did Ancient slash Medieval Borders Work? This has been a topic that has interested me so much, because especially looking back then, with various empires and kingdoms simultaneously declining and rising, and very turbulent situations, around like Europe and eastward, just a constant shifting of how did everyone keep track of borders, especially like I said, like with the constant wars and the switching of territory. I've been interested, just like how did everyone like keep track of like the borders, and not only just keep track but also fortify in a sense. I imagine it'd be confusing for some places, especially with shifting who's in charge, whose empire or kingdom you're under for the week or two. So yeah, I think of like the Roman series, mainly Diocletian. I believe it was after the what was it? Especially after the crisis of the third century, that the Romans really stepped up their defensive game, and it was along the Danube that they started building stronger fortresses and you know, like defenses along the Danube, and Diocletian, I believe, really helped propel that. And also, a lot of Diocletian's reforms could have easily given way to the medieval era, especially like more westward, like with his currency and the gold coin and whatnot. So that's probably a segue later leading to the medieval era, at least in terms of fortifying what they established to be their border along that line. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than I really want to learn just how did everyone keep track of it and how they did it, because we know with modern borders things are very regulated, firmly established, lines are drawn, and it's not so easy to just walk into a different country or nation. Like when I went to Mexico, for instance, it was a pretty there was a lot of process, like papers and whatnot, in order to cross and get back, from Mexico back to America. There were, gates and checks and whatnot, border patrol as we know it. So, but again, that's modern things. I'm really interested in how fortified or what kind of regulations, or if there are any, back then, especially in the medieval era slash ancient. Oh gosh, sorry. So yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than if you like my content and or if you like any of my thoughts or commentary, I would like to ask, feel free to please like, comment, subscribe to this small but humble channel of mine. It would really help me a lot, and I would really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. So with that said, and without any further ado, let's get to it, shall we? Let's watch History Matters. How did ancient slash medieval borders work?
Bala-Nassau, there is a line on the floor. If you're on one side of this line, you're in the Netherlands with its fancy windmills. If you're on the other, you're in Belgium with its convenient access for German armoured divisions. Nowadays, many a nation is easily recognisable by its silhouette, and within the borders of a nation, we can easily determine who its people are and all that good stuff. The obvious question is, was it so clear in the ancient or medieval world? Let's say you're a Roman peasant, congratulations, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, who ruled Rome at its greatest territorial extent. If you simply walked north from Rome, when, if ever, would you know that you'd left the Roman Empire? See, Rome is a good example when discussing borders, because it had a centralised government, a professional army whose job it was to protect the empire, and also the Romans had a good sense of borders, which they called limes. Unsurprisingly, much of Rome's limes stopped at natural barriers, like mountain ranges or perhaps most notably the Rhine or Danubian rivers. The border was sporadically lined with watchtowers and wooden fortifications where possible, but this was a long border and so naturally much of it was unmarked. The biggest exception to this was of course Hadrian's Wall. Map Maps like this make it look like these areas were firmly in Rome's control and that those outside were entirely foreign. To put it bluntly, this simply wasn't the case. There
Oh.
were settlements close to the empire's borders who made quite a living trading with Rome, and many of those within the Roman Empire didn't really see themselves as being Roman. Looking at you, Britannia. So,
You know, that's something I've been really interested in. Kind of like how Rome was such a big, the Roman identity, right? Like, all the way to these very far off lands and whatnot, like edges of the empire, especially as you're kind of, especially it's just Rome had such a huge grasp on so many different cultures and dialects, like, obviously, kind of like, I think like obviously America has been called such a big melting pot, and there is a lot going on here, so it's like we're all American. I consider myself American, even though in terms of ethnicity, I'm like Hispanic, Central American, that's where my family hails from, though I take on the American identity because I was born and raised here, and I'm guessing you must have worked like that with the Romans to some degree, but also just how some can feel kind of detached, especially with such a large empire covering so many groups of people. But that is interesting, just how he just mentioned how some might see themselves as under like the Roman banner, but also not be Roman. That creates such a unique perspective of just how an average person, like just saying the African continent of Rome, would just view themselves as,
Looking at you, Britannia. So, travelling in and out of the Empire wasn't too difficult, and many traders did so regularly, even via hard borders like Hadrian's Wall. This ease of travel is why there's so many Roman items and coins found throughout Central, Eastern and Northern Europe. Of course, in the south of the Empire, basically the North African coast and Egypt, the southern borders were much harder to patrol. Egypt's southern frontier was one such difficult border, but it did bring great profits. Here, the Romans had to deal with tribes like the Blemmyes. You may have heard of them before because the Romans believed that these were a people who didn't have heads. The Romans had a good trading relationship with the Blemmyes, who acted as intermediaries between Rome and the south of Africa, but the Blemmyes would occasionally raid too. Perhaps Rome's most important border was that with the Parthian, later Sasanian Persian Empire. Here, the border was a series of fortifications with many legions waiting for any Persian invasion, but again, people could and did travel between them. None of what I've told you was stagnant though. Rome's borders and the look of them fluctuated massively over the centuries until it all came crashing down. So, moving forward over 1,000 years from Hadrian, we reach the medieval period, and here we'll focus on the Anglo-Scottish border, formalised in the 1237 Treaty of York. Just to let you know, the Anglo-Scottish border is not marked by Hadrian's Wall, the entirety of which lies in England. This may come as a shock to you, but throughout history, England and Scotland have not been the best of friends. The borderlands, known as the Marches, played host to many a raid or military campaign over the centuries, as both sides sought to bring the other into a permanent state of non-existence. During times of peace, the two lands had to coexist, and local lords came to agreements, such as allowing livestock from either kingdom to graze on each other's lands. That's not to say things were peaceful. Bandits, or reeves as they were known, would raid across the border often. In fact, the practice of Scottish raiders extorting money from Englishmen gave birth to the word blackmail, roughly translated as meaning illicit rent.
Wow. I did not know where that's the term where it originated from. Dang, that is cool.
Policing these raids was basically impossible since there was no government capable enough to oversee the roughly 100-mile border. The law of the land on both sides was essentially try not to die, and neither the Scottish nor the English crowns were able to do much about it. Needless to say, the border between the two kingdoms in 1237 wasn't simply this line, it was blurred and much of it wasn't defined by natural barriers. To conclude, borders in the modern sense didn't exist either in theory or in practice in the ancient or medieval world. What we think of today as borders, those things which can block individuals from moving into a political entity, simply weren't feasible 1,000 years ago. Instead of strict borders, there were frontiers which marked a gradual shift from one polity to the next. The frontiers were primarily used by empires or kingdoms to keep out mass movements, i.e. armies instead of individuals, and in that sense they worked quite well. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Dang, that is beyond interesting. I was so fascinated and just how, like I said, when we covered so many wars and empires and kingdoms, just how quickly everything changes, and obviously the maps show a solidified thing, like with the Romans, but like in practice, in actual like practice, the lines were so much more blurred, and I guess flexible is the word I'd use, you know, subject to shrinkage and change because they're not the way we think of it, you know, which is pretty solidified, I feel, and more rigid to kind of, especially for the individual, to just get from one place to the other. Okay, that was cool. That answers so many questions I've had in so many videos that we've watched. So once again, man, History Matters does not miss. The link to this video is down below, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.